One of the things that made this week hard for me was that there seemed to be a through line, at least by the end of the week, and this was the lesson. If you're a victim, speak up and fight back, and then we'll valorize you. If you're a victim, speak up and fight back, whether you're a victim of a vicious, untrue political campaign to impede your nomination, fostered by uncaring Democrats intent on power, Judge Kavanaugh's view, or whether you're the victim of a sexual assault doing her civic duty to publicly state facts about a man's moral character that should be known before a judge receives a lifetime appointment on the U.S. Supreme Court, Dr. Christine Blasey Ford's testimony. Either way, what we seem to be saying on both sides of this debate is that a victim should speak up and fight back. And of course, Esther's story that we heard today would seem to reinforce this. Speak up, fight back, take great risks, be brave. But when we dig deeper into that lesson, I don't think it's enough to just focus on what the victim should be doing, the one who says he or she is a victim. It is true that speaking up is often risky, and it is true that sometimes we are in a special position, as Esther was, when we have special privileges and therefore an obligation to risk that position and speak up. It would seem that applies to senators now. But to say, as is being touted, how valiant Dr. Blasey Ford was and how courageous Judge Kavanaugh was, because both were victims and both stood up and spoke out fighting back, doesn't seem sufficient for God's people reading God's word today. I see three problems as I dug into our scripture today, the story of Esther. Is there more than this, that God asks you to use your position to speak up and fight back? Of course, in her story, the stakes were high. Her people stood to be slaughtered by the king because his prime minister, Haman, was incensed that people would not bow before him, that one man, Mordecai, would not bow before him, because for Jews, they bow only to God, not before an idol made of a person. And so Haman convinces the king to sign a decree, and all the people who are Jewish spread throughout the empire will be killed. But here are my three concerns in applying the story only to say God asks you to use your position to speak up and fight, as Esther did. First, if we laud the victims to speak up, Esther herself, who was a Jewish woman, does that place the burden on the victims to come forward, rather than having us focus on those who inflict harm in the first place? To stop, to not victimize another human. Stop, what you did was unacceptable. Don't we need to keep this focus? Whenever, on any side, a person is treated as if she or as if he does not matter, that's wrong. Individual lives matter. Each of us a child of God. So don't put the burden on the brave victim to speak up. Focus on those who violated another human, either the sexual assaulter or, in Judge Kavanaugh's view, the politically conniving Democrats. In the case of Esther, don't let either Haman and the king off the hook. You see, in Esther, the king had essentially been blind to the impact of Haman's scheme to kill her and all Jews. When Esther describes it to the king, he is shocked and asks, well, who ordered this massacre of you that will include you, my dear queen? Well, we know the king had signed the order, but apparently without much thought. That's an easy decision if those who will be harmed by your acts are powerless, a small, little, unknown tribe scattered across your empire. You don't even remember that you signed it. Why would you? The victims are unimportant. Instead, the king in this story is focused, riveted on retaining his power. We hear earlier that there had been a plot to assassinate him. It's foiled. So the threat is real. How will he keep his power? He really wants to know. And as his second in command, the prime minister, Haman, is also determined to keep his power. This man, Mordecai, seems like a threat because he is not willing to violate his faith and bow before the king or Haman, and wanting to ensure that no one else gets the idea that they can flout him, Haman or the king. Haman approaches the king with his plan and astutely appeals to the king's fear of losing power, asserting that the entire Jewish people do not obey the king's law and so are potential threats, though it is only Mordecai who has taken that position. But slights for those in power are not to be tolerated, so an edict goes out condemning a whole group. Easy to do if members of the group aren't known by you by name. Each is a child of God. Both the king and Haman remind us of what we humans will do once in power if we want to keep it. We'd be horrified by any who don't bow down to us. So my first point about the story of Esther is to remember that while we can valorize the brave victims who stand up, keep the focus on Haman and the king, who are both ruthless, willing to ignore the cries of true powerless victims. Second, if our only lesson is that victims are heroic when they speak up, that could place the burden on the victims to ask rather than demanding that anyone who knew about the heinous acts step in at the time to stop it, to say, this is wrong. If you believe Christine Blasey Ford, another person did know about her assault and didn't do anything to stop it. We'll focus on him. And focus on the many people who knew about the general school culture of boys' proud conquests over girls, about getting drunk. We know because it was printed in the yearbook of this Jesuit school. It was in plain daylight. But students and parents and priests turned a blind eye, failed to speak up against the wider culture. It's nice to have a victim speak up, but what about all the complicit silent people who enabled the system in the first place? So, people of God, we must demand that no one turn a blind eye at any time to a child of God who isn't being honored as one. We might fall out of favor with powerful friends, but speak up anyway. That warning is, of course, embedded in the Esther story, because you see, we might look at her not only as a potential victim, herself a Jewish woman, but also as one who could have been tempted to ignore the harm that others besides herself were facing. Remember, she has no idea why her uncle Mordecai is outside the palace walls and in this odd outfit of wailing and mourning with ashes spread over him. And once she learns from him of the decree to kill all Jews, she initially demurs about helping stop the slaughter. Mordecai, don't you know that if I go before the king, I could be killed? I'm not allowed to go when I want. I have to wait for him to call me. And then I would be killed and he wouldn't even hear me. It's not a foolproof plan. I shouldn't try. Maybe Esther is thinking, if I don't speak up, at least I can escape death. No one knows I'm Jewish here. Surely I should just keep my head down and be quiet. If I don't rock the boat now, maybe later I'll be in a position to, as queen, do some good for my people. And Mordecai responds to all these natural human evasions we have when asked to do something hard and brave and dangerous. Don't turn a blind eye, Esther, hoping that you'll stay in the good graces of that powerful king, that you'll be an exception. Don't we always hope we'll be the exception and not the victim? No, he says, don't turn a blind eye. Don't you parents or don't you other students turn a blind eye to the assault if you knew about it. Don't you in the overall turn a blind eye to the overall culture. Don't tell yourself you'll be the exception or your daughter or your son so you don't need to get involved. It's risky to speak up. I remember that as a parent. You take on powerful alumni and powerful parents who fight back. The king might kill you because you've dared to affront him, come when not called. But without anyone speaking up, even if you do save yourself, says Mordecai, all the other Jews will be killed. All the other kids in the schools following after you for years will be caught up in that same deadening culture for girls. Everyone admits that was the culture on both sides of this debate. Esther doesn't teach only that a potential victim must put herself at risk to bravely speak out. Esther also teaches that those who know about the harm to others who could make a difference because they have more power than the ones being hurt, that they need to risk speaking up, even if not guaranteed success. And third, if the only takeaway we have from this week is that victims should be brave and speak up, then we slide into that question of why some victims aren't brave immediately, why they wait so long to tell their stories. We might even be tempted to ask, if you take two victims, both Dr. Blasey Ford and Judge Kavanaugh, why couldn't Dr. Blasey Ford be as brave a victim as Judge Kavanaugh has been, fighting back right away? That the speed somehow of your response is a measure of its truth. Remember that being suggested? If it really was that bad, she would have spoken up sooner and told someone. It couldn't be then that all the adults around any child turning the blind eye to the culture and maybe living the culture themselves could mean that a child might have assumed that speaking up would do no good, that she would be shamed, that she would be the shame-worthy one. At Yad Vashem this summer in Israel, the museum that commemorates or memorializes, I should say, the Holocaust, I was reminded of two lessons. First is of the human tendency to turn a blind eye to things. We all do it, as our guide said. Here we are all the Jews who suffered, and here we are all the Germans who caused the suffering. And so the museum seeks to tell us what the consequences of turning a blind eye are. Yad Vashem was designed by Cambridge architect Moshe Safdie. And one immediately notices that the building has so much natural light, just pours in from above. Why? Because the Holocaust took place in broad daylight for all to see. And once you pass the first exhibit, you're forced to leave your comfort zone. And we step off the carpet and descend on unrelenting, bare concrete floors until you reach the nadir, all the way at the bottom, the exhibit room on Auschwitz, the Nazi extermination camp in Poland where over 1 million Jews were murdered. The descent that you take zigs and zags back and forth across the center shift where the light is coming from. And it creates a sense that there was just this slight incline, just a seemingly incremental and indirect path that we humans can take until we find ourselves in a place we could not ever have imagined we would arrive. Could Hitler have been stopped earlier? So we passed the exhibit, January 1933, when he was elected by the normal people of Germany. We passed the exhibit where in 1933, just 3 months later, all books by Jewish authors were burned in the street. And then September 1935, the Nuremberg laws, who defined Jews on the one hand and Germans on the other, only the true Germans allowed to intermarry with one another, Jews no longer human beings or citizens. Or maybe it was August 1936, the Berlin Olympics, where the whole world did attend, a victory for Hitler. We all went despite what had happened in broad daylight. Or maybe July 1938 was pivotal when the Evian Conference, convened by FDR in France, tried to grapple with Jewish refugees fleeing Germany, and Hitler expressly said, "Take them, take the Jews." And no country, other than the Dominican Republic, would give visas. The governor of Alaska explained that their air was so pure it couldn't be polluted by Jews. Or might it have been October 1938 Kristallnacht, the night of breaking glass, or which was the start of the free reign violence against Jews, or September 1939 when the Nazis invaded Poland, the Jewish ghettos. In broad daylight, things happen, and we are all called to speak up. I also learned something worse while I was there at Yad Vashem. I saw our human proclivity to favor fighters and the corollary, which is that we blame the real and voiceless victims. I learned this because Israel, when they first wanted to name what the day would be to remember the Holocaust, considered many dates. They considered all that I've already described to you, but they chose to valorize the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, where Jews fought back. They were unsuccessful, of course, so few of them against such a big machine. But that was important at the founding of Israel, we were told by those who helped create and make that decision. It was important because Israel needed strong, brave people to establish itself as a new nation, to take back the land from the desert, and to fight the neighbors who were enemies all around them. But Shlomo went on, Solomon, the man who was speaking to us, and asked, why did the victims not talk? Why was there not more done about the victims in the original museum? He said, maybe it was because what happened to them was unspeakable. There are no words for it. Maybe it was because they were so busy building a world after World War II. Or maybe, he said, it was the shame that they had survived. You see, we now know that the example I'm about to give happened time and time again. In one Israeli kibbutz, where a woman saw another with an Auschwitz tattooed number on her arm, she asked the survivor contemptuously, why didn't you fight? Survivors of the Holocaust felt shame. They had been led as sheep to the slaughter. And for many years, they could only whisper among themselves. But that changed with the trial of the Nazi Adolf Eichmann in the 1930s. They were called to be witnesses. And finally, the whole world heard the horror of what they experienced. Their stories were honored, and their experience came to be understood, and they could be proud to be a Holocaust survivor. What do we learn from all of this? What do we as God's people learn from God's message? If you are a victim of unspeakable horror, we stand with you. We honor you as a child of God. If you have been unfairly blamed, we stand with you. If you are aware of injustice, then speak up for those who are still voiceless, not to gain or retain power for yourself, but to do what is right. For what does the Lord require of us but to do justly, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with thy God? May we do so. Amen.